I'm Abigail, 32 years old. 2 weeks ago, my sister made a surgical error in her social life. She accidentally added me to a family group chat titled Real Family Only. Thousands of messages spanning 7 years. In those threads, I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was the charity case. They placed bets on when I'd fail my medical residency. They celebrated with champagne emojis when my marriage fell apart. My own mother, Michelle, wrote, and I'm quoting her exactly, "At least she doesn't have kids. One less grandchild to worry about." I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I screenshotted every single word, capturing every lie and every betrayal. Then I sent just one text, "Thanks for the receipts." What I did next, at my great-grandmother's 90th birthday party, nobody in Savannah saw coming. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I looked at the clock on my nightstand, 11:51 p.m. The air in my apartment was still heavy with the humidity of a Savannah summer, but inside I was freezing. My hands, the hands that had performed intricate surgeries on tiny hearts, were perfectly steady. As a pediatric surgeon, I am trained to remove what is toxic before it kills the patient. This was no different. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 9 years, and it was time for the final audit. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't send a follow-up text demanding an explanation. I simply opened my laptop, the blue light reflecting off my glasses with clinical precision, and I started clicking cancel. For years, I had been footing the bill for a lifestyle they used to belittle me with. I was the one working 60-hour weeks in the intensive care unit, so my sister, Victoria, could maintain her influencer aesthetic, and my mother, Michelle, could live in that ancestral mansion on the river. I logged into the portal for the first supplementary credit card, Victoria's. The current balance was $4,820. I scanned the recent transactions, a pair of designer heels, 3 separate visits to an elite hair salon, and a dinner at a rooftop bar that cost more than my weekly groceries. I hit the button to deactivate the card immediately. The reason for cancellation? Lost or stolen. And she had stolen. She had stolen 7 years of my trust while calling me a charity case behind my back. Next was the automatic transfer for Michelle's health plan. My mother had played the weak heart card the moment I earned my first paycheck as a resident. She had convinced me that the Savannah house was a burden she couldn't carry while her health was failing. For nearly a decade, I had been paying $1,500 a month for a private nurse and a holistic wellness plan. I pulled up the bank records. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. This wasn't a daughter's rebellion. It was accounting. I terminated the transfer and watched the confirmation screen glow. By 12:03 a.m., the procedure was complete. The financial arteries had been clamped. The silent investor had withdrawn her capital. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the crushing weight of their expectations. My phone began to vibrate on the desk, a call from Michelle. I didn't answer. Seconds later, a frantic string of texts from Victoria appeared. I didn't read them. I went back to my spreadsheet, my mind clear and my pulse slow. In the hospital, we don't respond to the loudest screams. We respond to the data on the monitor. The data tonight was undeniable. They weren't shocked by what they had done in that group chat. They were only going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. I rubbed my eyes, trying to find a shred of regret, but there was only clarity. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. In Savannah, the family name carries a specific weight. It's a brand built on generations of prestigious physicians. We were the doctor dynasty, a polished image of medical excellence and Southern grace. For 9 years, I was the primary laborer in that factory of perfection. I worked 60-hour weeks in the pediatric intensive care unit, often staying long after my shift ended because a tiny patient needed a steady hand. While I was scrubbing in for emergency surgeries at 3 in the morning, the hallway smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion, my mother and sister were curating a different reality. Victoria's life was a carefully filtered stream of high-tea events and luxury unboxings, all subsidized by my overtime pay. I wasn't just her sister. I was the silent partner in her influencer career. I paid the taxes on the family mansion, the insurance on her European sports car, and the private club memberships that kept them in the elite circles of Georgia society. I told myself it was my duty. I told myself that being part of a medical legacy required sacrifice. But the truth was far more clinical. In my mother Michelle's eyes, I was the stain from a previous life. I was the living, breathing reminder of her first marriage, a relationship she viewed as a tactical error before she married into the pure family line. Victoria was the golden child, the perfect successor to the new narrative. I was simply the surplus labor required to keep that narrative afloat. For years, I accepted this dynamic as my baseline. I realize now that my family had perfected the trap of cruel normalization. In social psychology, this happens when a group chooses a scapegoat to carry all their hidden failures. To Michelle and Victoria, my exhaustion wasn't a gift. It was a debt I owed for the inconvenience of my existence. They didn't feel guilty for taking my money or my time because they had convinced themselves that my role in the family was to be useful, not to be loved. They had successfully normalized the idea that my life was a resource they were entitled to harvest. It was a psychological subscription service, and they had been using my compassion as a credit line with no limit. I spent nearly a decade trying to buy my way into a family that had already decided I didn't belong. Every paycheck I surrendered was a down payment on an emotional mortgage that could never be settled. I thought if I worked harder, if I saved the family name one more time, they would finally see me. But a surgeon should know better. You cannot heal a patient who refuses to admit they are sick. And my family wasn't sick. They were predators who had mistaken my silence for permission. This wasn't just a toxic relationship. It was a business model where I was the only one providing the capital. I sat in my quiet apartment, looking at the pediatric surgery awards on my wall that they had never once acknowledged. I realized that my success was a threat to their story. If I was brilliant, if I was a lifesaver, then I couldn't be the worthless burden they needed me to be. The receipts I had gathered weren't just bank statements. They were the closing documents on a contract I was finally ready to breach. My phone continued its rhythmic dance across the desk for the next 48 hours. 112 notifications from Michelle and Victoria. When the frantic calls didn't work, the tactics shifted to public defamation. Victoria posted a black and white selfie to her 50,000 followers, her eyes artfully red, with a caption about the heartbreaking toll of medical burnout. She hinted that her dear sister was having a psychological breakdown and had become a danger to herself and the family. She was using my professional reputation as a weapon, trying to discredit the surgeon before I could reveal the woman. I felt the invisible chains of a survivor tightening around my throat. For years, I had stayed in this dynamic because of a psychological phenomenon called learned helplessness. I was like a patient who had spent so long in a dark room that I began to fear the light. I was a world-class surgeon who could repair a neonatal heart, yet I was terrified of a phone call from my mother. I had been conditioned to believe that my value was tied to my utility. I stayed because I was waiting for a version of them that didn't exist. I was a survivor who had mistaken my endurance for loyalty. But as I watched the comments on Victoria's post call me unstable and cruel, the last link in that chain finally snapped. The transition to the night of the gala was silent. Michelle called me on Thursday, her voice a fragile whisper. "Abigail, let's not make great-grandmother Beatrice's 90th birthday a battleground," she said. "It's a low-key garden gathering. Just wear something casual, honey. Jeans and a nice sweater." We don't want to overwhelm her. I looked at the text preview I had seen on her counter days ago. Remember, cocktail dress. Photographers coming at 4. I didn't correct her. I didn't argue. I simply said, "I'll be there." The ancestral mansion on the Savannah River was a fortress of white pillars and ancient oaks. As I pulled into the driveway, the smell of expensive perfume and blooming jasmine hit me. I was wearing a pair of dark denim jeans and a simple cotton top. I walked through the iron gates and into a sea of silk, lace, and sharp black tuxedos. It was the most formal event Savannah had seen in a decade. The local press were there, their flashes catching the diamonds around Victoria's neck. The silence that followed my entrance was clinical. The family turned their heads in unison. Victoria stood in the center of the garden in a floor-length emerald gown, her glass of vintage champagne frozen halfway to her lips. Michelle's face was a mask of calculated horror. She rushed toward me, her voice loud enough for the nearby city council members to hear. "Oh, Abigail," she cried, clutching her pearls. "I told you it was a black tie event. Are you really that confused? Is the stress at the hospital finally too much?" She was performing the concerned mother role for an audience of 60 people. I stood there, the only person in casual clothes, a literal smudge on their perfect family portrait. But I didn't shrink. I didn't blush. I looked directly into the lens of the family photographer and maintained the steady gaze I use when a surgery takes a turn for the worse. I wasn't the one who should have been embarrassed. I was just the mirror reflecting the pathology of their lies. I was the visible evidence of the drama they had tried so hard to exclude. And for the first time, I realized that being the disappointment was actually my greatest power. Robert Barnes had been the silent observer of my family's dynamics for 3 decades. He met me at a small, private office late on a Tuesday night. He didn't offer me tea or platitudes. He simply slid a leather portfolio across the desk. "This is the paper trail Victoria thought she had buried," he said. I opened the folder. As a surgeon, I'm used to looking at complex scans to find a hidden tumor. This was the same. I saw the withdrawal slips from the trust fund my biological father had established before his death. The amount was staggering, $1,500,000. It was meant to cover my medical school, my specialization, and my future. Instead, the balance was zero. I zoomed in on the signatures. They were perfect almost. To anyone else, it was my handwriting. But I am a surgeon. I spend my life studying fine motor control. The loop on the capital A had a hesitation that I do not possess. It was a forgery, a methodical, cold-blooded theft of my birthright. Robert pointed to the ledger. "Look at the transaction dates, Abigail. 3 years ago, when you were drowning in student loans to pay for your residency, your sister was spending $50,000 at a private surgical clinic in Beverly Hills. She didn't have a medical emergency. She bought a new face with your father's life insurance money. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. While I was scrubbing in for 15-hour shifts, exhausted and surviving on vending machine coffee, Victoria was using my inheritance to fund her luxury unboxings. Every designer bag she flaunted, every first-class flight to Paris, every influencer retreat was paid for with the money my father had intended for my protection. Michelle had signed off on all of it. My mother, the woman who had just called me confused in front of Savannah's elite, had witnessed my father's will and then helped her golden child dismantle it. They hadn't just used my current income. They had cannibalized my past. They had stolen the only thing my father had left me to ensure I'd never have to rely on them. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was a criminal enterprise. I looked at Robert. "Can we prove the forgery?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. Robert nodded. "I've already contacted a forensic document examiner. The mismatch is undeniable. You hold the killing blow, Abigail." I closed the portfolio. The weight of it felt solid in my hands. For years, they had called me a charity case to hide the fact that they were the thieves. They had created a narrative of my failure to distract from their own crimes. I realized then that my casual clothes at the gala weren't a mistake. They were the beginning of an autopsy. I was going to open up this pure family and show the world the rot inside. My biological father had worked until his last day to ensure I'd be a doctor. He didn't leave that money for a family brand. He left it for me. Victoria and Michelle hadn't just spent currency. They had spent his love. They had traded my father's legacy for Instagram likes and emerald gowns. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scalpel on bone. This audit was over. The next stage was the extraction. The gala moved into the formal toasts as the sun dipped below the Savannah River, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. Victoria took the microphone, her emerald gown shimmering under the strings of fairy lights like a poisonous snake in the grass. She began a practice speech about the family legacy, speaking of compassion, medical excellence, and the sacred bond of blood. She even had the audacity to look toward me, her eyes brimming with fake pity, as she mentioned the importance of supporting struggling family members. It was a masterclass in performance art, a polished lie designed to secure her position as the heir to the family fortune. But the Doctor dynasty had forgotten one thing. Empires are built on records, and great-grandmother Beatrice was the one who had written the original ledger. Just as Victoria reached her crescendo, Beatrice stood up from her high-backed chair. She didn't look like a woman recovering from heart failure. She looked like a judge delivering a final verdict. She reached into the pocket of her lace cardigan and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, the same one I had seen on her nightstand for 10 years. "I have been keeping track," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the humid air with the sharpness of a cold scalpel. The garden went silent, 60 guests holding their breath as she opened the worn pages. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the truth. She began to read the entries, date by date, hour by hour. March 15th, 2019. Abigail arrived at 3 a.m. after a double shift because I was afraid of the dark. Victoria posted a video from a launch party in Atlanta. November 2nd, 2020. Abigail paid the property taxes on this mansion to keep it from foreclosure while surviving on hospital cafeteria food. Michelle called to say she was too busy with her garden club to visit my specialist. She flipped through the pages, her steady voice detailing 9 years of my invisible labor contrasted against their documented neglect. As I watched Michelle's face turn a sickly shade of gray, I realized they were suffering from the illusion of power from an empty wallet. My mother and sister had convinced themselves they were the elite of Savannah, but their status was a subscription they could no longer afford. In social psychology, there is a distinct difference between having and being. Victoria had the designer clothes and the influencer following, but she was nothing without the capital I provided. Their authority was a borrowed robe, and Beatrice had just grabbed the hem to pull it off. Victoria tried to speak, her hand trembling as she reached for the microphone again, but Beatrice ignored her. "I've seen who shows up, and I've seen who performs," my great-grandmother stated, closing the book with a heavy thud. "The girl you call a charity case is the only one who actually understands the meaning of this name." I looked at Victoria, and for the first time, I didn't see the golden child. I saw a girl standing in a $1 million garden, realizing her net worth was about to hit zero. The silence in the garden was no longer polite. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. I stepped forward into the center of the lights, my dark jeans, a sharp contrast to the shimmering emerald silks and tailored tuxedos surrounding me. I didn't need a microphone to be heard. My voice had the calibrated edge of a surgeon explaining a fatal diagnosis. I pulled the leather portfolio from my bag, the one Robert Barnes had meticulously compiled. For years, I had been the silent investor in their lies, but the audit was finally complete. I looked directly at Victoria, who was clutching the edge of a table, her knuckles white against the tablecloth. I began to speak, my words factual and lethal. I detailed the $1,500,000 that had vanished from my trust fund. I explained how the signature of a dead man, my father, had been resurrected through forgery to fund Victoria's cosmetic surgeries, and a wardrobe that cost more than a pediatric intensive care wing. I watched as the 60 guests, the very elite they had tried so hard to impress, began to pull back, their expressions shifting from curiosity to pure disgust. Michelle fell to her knees on the manicured grass, her face a ruin of smudged makeup and genuine terror. "Abigail, please," she sobbed, her hands reaching for the hem of my casual top. "We can fix this privately. Think of the family name. Think of our honor. Honor is a currency you spent years ago," I replied, my voice clinical and devoid of the heat they expected. I looked down at her, not with anger, but with the detached observation I give to a specimen in a lab. "You were relieved I didn't have children because it meant one less grandchild to worry about. You celebrated my divorce in a group chat called Real Family Only while I was paying your medical bills." I pulled a single sheet of paper from the file, the formal notice of a criminal complaint for forgery and grand larceny. I placed it on the table in front of them. You told me I was too dramatic for a classy event like this. You were wrong. I'm not the drama. I'm the consequence. Your honor didn't die tonight, Michelle. It died 7 years ago when you sent the first message in that chat. I turned away as the first murmurs of the guests broke out like a localized storm. Behind me, the family was finally being seen for exactly what they were, a bankrupt brand with nothing left to sell but their shame. The ancestral mansion on the river was officially signed over to me the following morning. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a surgeon who had finally finished a grueling 12-hour shift and stepped out of the hospital into the fresh morning air. The anger wasn't loud anymore. It was replaced by a clinical, focused sense of peace. I blocked Michelle and Victoria across every single platform, phone, email, and social media. They were no longer my family. They were just an old medical debt I had finally paid in full. I didn't need their tears, their excuses, or their hollow promises ever again. I transitioned the estate into a silent medical foundation for pediatric patients, using the space to heal others instead of housing the rot of my family's lies. It was no longer a monument to a name, but a sanctuary for those who actually needed care. Sitting on the balcony overlooking the Savannah River, I watched the sunset paint the water in shades of deep gold and purple. I realized that true freedom isn't found in a mansion or $1,500,000. It is the quiet, powerful moment you stop needing people who don't care about you to validate your worth. I was no longer an invisible charity case or a burden to be bet upon. I was Abigail. And for the first time in 32 years, I was truly free. Sometimes being removed from a toxic group chat is the greatest gift you will ever receive. It is not just an exit. It is an invitation to a life that belongs entirely to you. Subscribe to join our community and hear more stories about the courage to set boundaries and the beautiful peace that follows.